Something broke into history, and that's what makes all the difference.
And they wanted to share that with us.
Now, a really good example is the Gospel of Luke. We're reading all this liturgical year now from the Gospel of Luke. Unlike Mark, who wrote a very rough and ready Greek, Mark was certainly not someone who was a native Greek speaker and writer and wrote in a kind of a plotting, straightforward way. Even Matthew, they think Matthew was originally in Hebrew or Aramaic and then was translated, and it sort of bears the marks of that.
No, Matthew does not bear the mark of that. I would be very interested to see what his evidence is for this. The only indication that we get about Matthew being originally written in Hebrew comes from Papias, and he just sort of ad hoc states that Matthew was written in Hebrew. In fact, all of the evidence that we have about Matthew points to it originally being written in Greek. Another thing is that the Greek doesn't appear to be translated from Hebrew, and that would come in the form of some awkward Greek constructions that would make a lot more sense once it's translated into Hebrew. We do have some instances of this for Aramaic, but it's not enough to say that Matthew was originally written in Aramaic. It's more like specific phrases were translated from Aramaic to Greek. And there is nothing that shows that something broke into history like the Kool-Aid Man.
Oh yeah!
People started believing in ridiculous things. That's it. That's not breaking into history. That's always happened in history, so I don't know what Bishop Barron could be talking about.
But Luke and John are both very good Greek stylists. They're operating at a higher literary level.
And I wanted to read something to you.
We never hear this in the liturgy, but it's the opening paragraph of the Gospel of Luke, in which he tells us precisely what he's doing. And I want you to listen to this. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word.
This introduction to Luke clues us in to the fact that Luke is just attempting to look like a historian while not actually doing anything that a first century historian would do. Things like citing their sources. We see Luke telling us that he consulted eyewitness accounts, but he doesn't tell us who these eyewitnesses were or why they were eyewitnesses. This is in stark contrast to real historians around this time. Real historians would tell us who these sources were by name and why they could provide a good source for whatever subject they were writing about. And we get none of this from Luke. Also, if Luke was writing his own historical account of the events that happened, why did he copy from both Matthew and Mark? Real historians don't just copy somebody else's words without notating that that's what they're doing, which is another thing. Luke doesn't take an active role in the history that he's writing about. That's in stark contrast to other historians at the time. If you want to know more about why Luke's gospel is definitely not history, even though the author tries to make it look like history, then you need to check out my Luke video on the GE Shorts channel. I should have it in the cards or in the description or somewhere. Just go check it out. I've got about 10 reasons as to why Luke is definitely not historical.
Okay, he's an historian who's done his research. He's read the relevant text. He's sought out the eyewitnesses, listened to them, and is now trying to give us an orderly account of the things that have happened and have been fulfilled among us. Listen, everybody, this is not the way myth makers talk. This is not once upon a time or in a galaxy far, far away. This man is talking about things that happen.
Well, he's right that this is not how people who are explicitly writing myths would introduce their topic. I would agree that Luke's author is mimicking historians, whilst at the same time not being a historian himself. Again, if he's giving us an orderly account of the events, why does he verbatim copy two other gospels without telling us who they were? And why do we know this now? Because of textual criticism that has connected all three of the gospels. Simply put, Luke's author was writing a theology about Jesus, not history, just like the other gospels. This is painfully obvious if you just take a critical look at these gospels without a religious lens. Sure, Luke's author attempts to create a historical account, but it's still an ahistorical hagiography. There could be some historical aspects to this hagiography, but how would you discern them? What criteria would you use to determine fact from fiction? And you can't use the idea that if all three of the synoptic gospels attest to this one singular thing, then that means that it most likely happened in history. That's because if it appears in all three, it means that it was most likely just directly copied with each redaction. There is literally no good way to discern fact from fiction in the Gospels, which ultimately makes them useless as historical sources.
When I was a student years ago, you heard so often the claim that, the Gospels, they were written long after the time of Jesus, and so they're mostly about the communities that produced them, and it's mostly the mind of the author. And what really happened with Jesus? Well, who knows about that? Nonsense.
The amount of time between Jesus' supposed death and when the Gospels were being written really doesn't matter all that much, with the exception of the conversations surrounding whether or not they had access to eyewitnesses. And considering that the Gospels were written at least after 70 AD, their hope for having eyewitness accounts are severely diminished. This is due to the fact that these eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection wouldn't have been educated enough to read or write, so there would be no written testimony of their experiences. They would have to communicate their experiences orally. By the time that the Gospels were written, it's right there on the edge of human life expectancy for the first century. It's true that some of these people could have survived into the first or the second Gospel being written. That would be Mark and Matthew. But, those are the extreme outliers in first century society. The gospel writers were writing for the communities that they existed in. Each gospel has its own message that they wanted to push beyond the general Christian message. That's why each author was compelled to write their own gospel, or rather, redact a previous gospel and tell their story different. And as I said before, we can't know what is historical and what isn't in each gospel. The only references that ever appear in the gospels are to scripture. So it kind of seems like they use scripture as a primary source of information for their gospel. That means that they're not based on historical events, but on magical books.
Let's say the earliest gospel, they speculate Mark, written around the year 70, Luke maybe 10 years after that. What if I were sitting down right now to write a definitive history of the JFK assassination? Now almost, 60 years ago. And I said, look, I've read all the books, I've read all the articles, all the research. I've talked to eyewitnesses. There are still some around. I spoke to a priest from Dallas some years ago who was a teenager in the parade that day when JFK went by. There are people still around who were eyewitnesses. Would you say I was writing a book of mythology? That I was writing a book of legends that had nothing to do with historical fact? No.
This is a bit of a bad analogy. We have a lot of evidence surrounding the JFK assassination. There was an entire investigation on the matter, in fact. It simply doesn't even compare to the Jesus story. Also, just because you say that you have an eyewitness account doesn't mean that the account is actually an eyewitness, or that what you wrote about the account is congruent with what the person actually told you. You could do all the historical research into a culture at a certain time and place in the past, and you can make up fictional stuff about that culture and time and place. A real comparison here would be like an account of 9/11 that was written primarily using Nostradamus' work. You could probably get some things correct, but it's not historically accurate.
You'd say this guy is a responsible historian. So Luke is writing history.
As well as he can at that time.
Because it matters that these things happen.
As well as he can? He can't even do the very basics of historiography for his time. The basics would be shit like properly citing your sources, constructing your own account of what historically happened instead of copying other people's work, and taking an active role in your history. If he was doing the very basics of historiography for his time, he would be doing these things. He doesn't, though, because he's not writing history. And I really don't think that it matters whether or not these events historically happened. It certainly didn't matter to Paul or the apostolic fathers like Justin Martyr. So I don't know why everybody's just now trying to historically validate Christianity.